God is love. Love is a healing remedy. We're going to reach out to areas where man has seemed to have difficulty. As we concentrate that the gifts of the Holy Spirit might function, or what the secularists might speak of as the paranormal, let us believe.
There's a flaw in humans that happens decade after decade, into generation after generation of people that hasn't been broke yet. It's the want or a need for a father or mother, a higher power that watches over them, loves them, protects them, desires relationship with just them, and loves them through all their flawed behaviors. It's the perfect recipe for a cult. Many cult leaders have come and gone and had their moment, sketched out their time in history, and many of the big ones are now dead and gone. Many people think that cults are a thing of the past, but it's not true. There's more cults today likely than there ever has been in our history. But when we talk about the grandfather of cult leaders, there's one that stands out more than any of them, even today, that people simply just come back to go over and over it again. It's the story of Jim Jones. Like most cult leaders, the message starts off simple, positive, encouraging, giving the look of a father who cares and love bombs the people around him. We saw something with the Jones revelation that's really never been seen since. It's a story that's almost too big to tell, and you have to pick parts of it. Obviously, the biggest part is what happened to Jonestown, the death of hundreds of people that loved the man that was their leader. They called him father, but the question is what got them to this point. The story that first started off as a simple message from one of the best cult leaders that we've ever seen. This is the message of Jim Jones.
This. They robbed us of our land, and they've taken us and driven us till we tried to find ourselves. We tried to find a new beginning, but it's too late. You can't separate yourself from your brother and your sister.
The story of death surrounding Jim Jones has been covered, maybe more than any other story, but it's what got people there to that point. Just how good was the message Jim preached that not only made people attend his church, clean it, donate time and money, but also leave the country, their home, and build a whole new life, and then ultimately ending their life and their family. It's a wild element to think about when you really start piecing it together. It's not a movie, it's not fantasy, it's real, involving real people with real lives. Fathers, mothers, children, babies, brothers, sisters, grandmothers, grandfathers. All the human elements were there in those final moments. 1955, Jones started his church, Wings of Deliverance. His message was focused on the powers of what God can do for you, healing, deliverance, and Jones himself taking the opportunities to focus on the crowd. And really some of the first crowd work ever filmed in a church. He would call out people by their names, saying elements they had, whether disease, heartaches, or simply needing to fix their back. It's honestly one of the first big radical movements in the modern church at that time. People speaking in tongues, dancing, no limits to their belief, because, as Jim taught his flock, they would do greater things than God himself had done. His church is mixed with all types of people from race, backgrounds, finding unity. When Jim starts his church, it's simply just that. It's a church, really nothing more at that moment. But for a church, it is radical. But it's not called a cult. It's not considered dangerous. It's quite the opposite. It's actually loved in the community. And at that time, the message is simple. The church will change lives, change the world, and people that are a part of it will prosper. They will find their own friends, make marriages, make children, and simply build as a community. They make a soup kitchen to feed the hungry. Many of these people that are in the early moments of Jim's church are the same people that will be there the last day. Jim does preach his own saying, "If you see me as your friend, I'm your friend. If you see me as your father, I'm your father. If you see me as your God, I'm your God." There's no doubt in the beginning stages, Jones is looking for full control over his flock, setting a passive-aggressive statements, wanting people to rely on him, love him, fear him, support him, and obey him. In the early stages of Jim's life, when he starts going to church, he calls himself and gives the look as a Methodist minister. In the early 50s, he shadows other ministers, learning how churches operate, how people attend church, and developing his own voice and movement in the church, but also getting people's attention, even in this early moment. Although in 1953, as Jim is seeking more, something would happen radical in his life that had no doubt set the pillars for what was to come in his faith and where things would go. Jim visits a Pentecostal church. It's loud, it's full of energy, and it's very different for him. But he says he loves it, and saying the Pentecostals were the ones that were disrespected and the rejects. And he found love with acceptance. This is where something happens to Jim. He says that a woman comes to him, lays her hands on him, and publicly announces him as a prophet, saying that God will use him in a radical way. There's witnesses, and Jim uses it. It's no doubt the fuel that would lead all the way to Jones starting People's Temple. So as Jones is now building out his road of faith and what he believes, and walking more in a charismatic Pentecostal lifestyle, he uproots his family and starts to travel, visiting other churches, speaking, taking donations from people in the church. Jones is loved, he's known about, his message is big, boisterous, radical. He's also talking about civil rights and holds on people and communities that the government wants to hold down. His message spreads throughout lower income neighborhoods to the regular person looking in. Jim is an amazing person, a father, husband, even adopting kids that he calls his own, calling them his rainbow family. One element that Jim applies to his message in the church was not to just have faith, but wanting to make a movement for achieving social change through Marxism. It was a huge pillar in Jim's thinking, spreading it throughout his sermon. On a weekly basis, the communities ate it up, making him one of the common folk that understood what lower class people had to deal with. From Jim's first church in the mid-1950s in Indiana that was called Wings of Deliverance, to later changing the name of the church to what the whole world would eventually know as People's Temple, Jim becomes a well-known preacher over the decade, opening other churches and simply having the same meetings and problems that churches deal with today. He makes deacons, elders, leaders. By the end of the 60s, Jim now has people in his circle that have been with him for quite some time now. They obey him at his command, and they seek more, just like Jim. How over 1,000 people packed up their life to a place they'd never been, that was hard to get to, where they would make a new life and set up homes in the wild with animals and bugs. In the early 70s, People's Temple made so much news before cell phones or the internet. The news of what People's Temple was doing spread like wildfire, where it was said that people were radically healed, miracles were taking place, people were growing fingers, legs, being cured of cancer, but they were cured in the church by divine intervention. So with that, as the news spread, the sick and hurt were flocking to People's Temple by the thousands. This made such an airwave that an investigation was set up in the church, and even a doctor demanded to see x-rays or samples of people's blood to prove that people were being healed of any ailment they had. Obviously, this didn't sit well with Jim, because the main pillar of his message was healing. People would give anything, money, time, belongings, their whole life, just to have one more day of breath, and that's what many of them did. But it's also how a cult becomes rich. But with thousands of people believing Jim Jones, there was 10 times as many that didn't believe Jim, and called his so-called miracles a hoax, saying he was leading people down roads that would simply take their life But an element was proven to be true, sadly, inside people's temple. People that worked in the church would help set up stories. If they knew people were coming to visit their church, or a family member could invite someone, they would find out private information on that person, secrets. And with that, Jones would call out the person in the crowd, knowing their name, knowing things that they haven't told many people, and saying that God was wanting to use them in a mighty way. People that didn't know any better were dumbfounded, and obviously came back for more. As that week-by-week situation continued to happen, people do what they do. They whisper to other people, and the secret gets out that Jones has people planted in the crowd, and that he's also doing background checks on people to find out personal information about them. It's not good for business for the People's Temple when their secret gets out. In 1973, a very pivoted, big situation would take place that would sadly and weirdly pivot a lot of the story in the next years to come. One late night, Jim was at a movie theater, an adult movie theater. While Jim is in there, he exposes himself to a man. Unfortunately for Jim, that man is an undercover agent. Jim is arrested on the spot. This now new problem in Jim's life that he needs to disappear, and all of the heat from the church lies, now sets up decisions that uproot over 1,000 people's lives on Jim's command. Jim behind the scenes has been scheming with ideas, and one of his ideas is huge. He's talked to only a few people about this, where he wants to pick up everything and start moving everyone with him. Jim starts to spread this in his message about picking up and leaving. He tells leaders to start talking about this. Jim and the people that he's talked to start looking for a place to go, and it doesn't take long before they find almost 4,000 acres in Guyana. It's cheap. Jim himself sends out scouts to look at it. But as this is going on, Jim is also redirecting his message and establishing a new look for the future of People's Temple. He talks about the hate that unbelievers have around them and the government's coming for them. He pushes these words into people's minds so they become sick of their life, making them want to quit their day-to-day life, going to work, paying taxes, just wanting freedom. The message sounds good, but it sounds too good. It's freedom that Jim is offering, and people take the bait. To make it short and sweet to the point, shady deals are made when it comes to buying the land in Guyana. They start with bare minimum necessities, huts, wells. It was a huge undertaking. It was built with the hands and money of People's Temple. They thought they were building the newest and improved civilization, but they had no idea it would also be a place where they couldn't leave, and essentially a mass grave. Jim saw Guyana as a place where he could have privacy from reporters and the feds looking in on him. It's by no random accident that buying the land in Guyana, deep in the jungle, was hard to get to. It was more than on purpose. Jim could sell it as a paradise, and it was for a moment to Jim. 500 people agreed in the beginning to leave their lives and travel to what they were told would be their new home and start building Jonestown. In 1977, Jones, with hundreds, moved to South America, and throughout that year many more followed. Jim starts filming immediately, wanting to document everything that's happening in Jonestown, what they're building, making, growing, people's happiness. And people were happy. Many people just wanted friendship, families, the bare minimums of what anybody just wants, a tribe to call their own and be a part of. What many people may not even be aware of with the whole story with Jonestown is that it was gone in the blink of an eye as fast as it started. Jonestown was barely a year old by the time it ended, as bulldozers were clearing off land for roads and houses when building Jonestown. Government bulldozers were coming right back in to destroy the huts. But in that short time, people make families, have children. But behind the scenes, Jim had once again been scheming a plan, a backup plan if you will, if he was to lose Jonestown. It's now known that Jones and many of his leaders in his close circle had a plan in place if the government came in and tried to take Jonestown away from them. Jim starts to buy and stock up a large amount of cyanide. Jim's message turns again, a message that was already surrounded in fear increases, that one day they may come to take our land. Jim is already trying to prepare people to not fear death, but not giving too much information about what he has planned. The outside world was wanting to know what Jonestown was, what they were doing in Guyana. Reporters start to ask questions and beg for interviews. In the end with Jonestown, it's a story that's been told many times about the gory details that are still hard to hear and dig through. But what triggered what happened in Jonestown started from the moment they landed in Guyana, with Jim trying to hide his church and everyone a part of it, and not wanting to lose control. In those last moments, while everyone is still breathing in Jonestown, it's visited by reporters, and it goes terribly wrong. People end up dead, and Jim plays his last card. He tricks people one last time, in the most terrible way possible. The cyanide that Jim has been stocking up in Jonestown, he's about to use it. He spreads the word that the time has come to make the ultimate sacrifice. Some people escaped, run into the jungle, or hide under huts, but almost everyone would end up murdered. Some were willing and some were forced. Ones that were forced were underage, and ones that weren't were held at gunpoint and were either told to drink the concoction that was made up of juice and cyanide mixed together, or take a shot of straight cyanide into their veins. The aftermath that took shape, with hundreds of people lying on the ground. Most of them were lying at the meeting center where everything started to take place in the beginning, but many of them too drank the juice in their huts and die in their bed or lying on the floor. When the crying ends and the last breath is taken, it's simply just nature that's left, bugs and birds. The sun bakes the bodies and rot sets in. When Jim's body is found, it's almost unrecognizable. The sun has beat it down and has started to decompose badly. You have to understand that these were people just like you and me, but they were simply tricked, or wanting to be a part of something so bad, a community, to be loved and accepted, that fear and rejection of being shunned by showing disapproval crippled their minds. There's hundreds, thousands of stories attached to Jonestown. Daughters, sons, husbands, fathers, grandchildren, grandfathers, grandmothers. It was all there. There's one story that emerges from Jonestown at first. A father is one of the first people on the scene at Jonestown. He was tipped off early on about the rumors in Jonestown and what people were planning. His daughter was one of the people there. He was hoping to make it to her in time, but as he's flying into Jonestown, hoping that his daughter was safe and willing to go back home with him, but as they get close to Jonestown, they start to smell a stench in the air, and soon, in the distance, they start to see what's happened. Hundreds of bodies laying on the ground. As he lands, he panics, and he starts to search for his daughter, hoping not to find her on the ground. Sadly, she was found and identified, and you see the first suffering from the aftermath of Jonestown. It's just the start of what's to come with the suffering families will have to endure soon enough. The cleanup of Jonestown, it isn't glorious or heroic. It's dirty, it's gruesome, it's a waste of life. Soon enough the army shows up. They clean up the bodies in what bio they can. Most of the town is tore down or just left for Mother Nature to take back, and that's just what happens. The jungle took Jonestown back. Most of it is unrecognizable, with just a few emblems still standing that made it all these years later. The end story of Jonestown is once again stranger than fiction. It shows the strength of what a dangerous message, the wrong message, what it can do to people. People even today still look for family, friends, a tribe of their own, somewhere where they can feel comfortable. Cults haven't gone anywhere. They're still around us, even more so than you would think. They're stronger and bigger than they've ever been before. Be careful who you listen to.